Our first stop, Singapore. The ships at harbor stretch to the horizon. The port's key position at the Strait of Malacca has made Singapore rich. The Strait of Malacca is a crucial shortcut between India and Asia. Economically and strategically, one of the most important shipping lanes on the planet, which makes Singapore critical to China's new plan to dominate the world economy. China calls it One Belt, One Road.
And they just took it.
Chang Heng-chi is Singapore's ambassador at large.
Is what China is doing the biggest global outreach by any country, you think, of all time?
Well, when Xi Jinping announced the One Belt, One Road initiative, everyone thought it was a grand vision. It is the greatest vision of all times. It's a vision that captures the old Silk Road economic initiative.
The Old Silk Road refers to a network of trade routes used for hundreds of years to move goods like silk and spices. China intends to spend $1 trillion to build new connections among Asia, Europe, and Africa, developing supply routes over land and water, putting China in a position to control trade and dictate terms. It's already building coal power plants in Pakistan, buying interest in foreign oil companies, and building a $6 billion railway that will connect 8 countries.
How do you think, if you are someone looking after U.S. interests, that the United States ought to view this strategic move by China?
I think the United States should pay attention to this. And if the United States sees itself as a global leader, then you would ask yourself, oh, what are they doing that I'm not doing? And actually, if this succeeds, where am I?
Today's Western influence on Singapore is obvious in its city center dressed to the nines. But China's influence is rising. It's already spending 1/3 of its One Belt, One Road investments in Singapore and recently closed an $11 billion deal to buy a Singaporean warehouse and logistics firm. Will China's tempting investments reorder the world order and pull U.S. allies in a different direction? Kirk Wagner is the former U.S. ambassador to Singapore. He says the U.S. may be losing ground.
That's been a little bit of a frustration for me. Now, we have 3,700 American companies that are based here in Singapore. Some people are getting the memo, but there are 21,000 American companies in Mexico.
What does Singapore do? What do these other Southeast Asian nations do with two great world powers trying to befriend and court them?
Most ASEAN countries, the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, really don't want to choose. They would like to be in the center, And I've said, trade is promiscuous. You can trade with as many partners as you like. Some countries have found the United States less willing to engage them, and so they've been engaging far more with China.
Against the opulence of Singapore, the Philippines is a rustic cousin. Almost 13 million people live in the capital of Manila, a chaotic collection of wealthy sky-rise neighborhoods built around a colonial-era polo club. The Philippines is another key country in China's One Belt, One Road initiative. By all accounts, Filipino President Duterte, elected last year, is pivoting away from the U.S. toward China, saying One Belt, One Road lines up with his own goal of upgrading his nation's infrastructure.
This administration particularly has indicated that they're shifting away from the U.S., which I think is a mistake in my own view.
Jose Quisia was the Philippine ambassador to the U.S. until last year.
The president would like to develop stronger ties with China and Russia. He believes that we've been too close to the U.S. and that he would like to strengthen relationships by showing that he is not as closely affiliated with the U.S. as the previous administration.
I think that from a geopolitical perspective, the Philippines is at an absolute critical juncture. I don't want to call it a battle, but essentially the competition over influence.
Jean Yu is a former U.S. Army Green Beret who now runs a security business in the Philippines, Black Panda.
In my opinion, One Belt, One Road is essentially China's answer to the Marshall Plan of what the states did after World War II.
In the Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George Marshall, the U.S. spent the equivalent of $103 billion to rebuild 16 European countries and secure alliances. China's investment and potential payoff are even bigger.
It's not exactly that way.
Professor Salita Mansad, a Filipino economist, is skeptical of deals being offered by China, such as loans so risky that Western countries won't make them and borrowing countries won't be able to pay the money back.
I don't mean to cast aspersions on China's initiative, but it's almost like bribery, it seems to me.
Well, what else is it? The fact is, China is willing to give softer loans, etc., and the clients are too anxious to get this money.
She sees uncertainty in the prospect of a rising China.
Why do you think the United States should be concerned about that?
So China will get the South, Asia and the Pacific, and then it will look forward more, and it will start bullying if it can, the same way that the United States did 100 years ago or 50 years ago. I would rather have the evil I know than the evil I don't know. Let's put it that way.
The last stop in our examination of One Belt, One Road is Korea.
Do you view the potential changes as something favorable for the region and the world?
I'm very concerned that China is becoming the biggest country in the world.
Congresswoman Hye-Hoon Lee leads South Korea's opposition party.
China's attitude toward our society is pretty much hostile.
And it's up to the infantry to clear out the pockets of die-hard communists.
China has been hostile since the 1950s, when it backed communist North Korea in the Korean War. In contrast, the U.S. has stood by South Korea.
The once proud capital of the Korean Republic is a mass of ruins.
And watched it grow from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of its biggest economic success stories. Today, 10 million people live in the modern, bustling capital city of Seoul. For all of South Korea's ties to the U.S., China is South Korea's #1 trade partner and in a position to tighten the screws. So earlier this year, when South Korea positioned U.S. anti-missile batteries amid North Korea's aggressive missile launches, China caused that provocative and slapped South Korea with threats and trade cuts. Congressman Kim Byung-gi serves on South Korea's defense and intelligence committees. He wants China to use its influence to rein in North Korea.
China is exerting more economic influence in South Korea, as well as military influence in North Korea.
China and North Korea have developed a strategic partnership, and if China really thinks we're a good friend, China should make their bad friend do the right things.
Is China exerting more influence than before?
China is a big sort of economic power and a growing sort of military power as well.
Political science professor Ra Chong-il was a campaign advisor to South Korea President Moon Jae-in, who was elected in May. In the end, he suspects China's One Belt, One Road is less about spreading prosperity and more about China trying to build a more dominant role on the world stage.
China is just beginning to throw its weight about to its neighbors. I think it is just the beginning.
These tropical islands and pristine beaches disguise a dangerous reality. After our nighttime arrival in a province called Mindanao in the southern Philippines, we're riding in a caravan guarded by armed security forces. Mindanao is the target of U.S. State Department travel warnings due to terrorist fighting and kidnappings.
This is Zamboanga City, which is under martial law as the country attempts to contain Islamic extremist violence, which has been bubbling up recently.
We're invited to board military fast boats accompanied by heavily armed commandos. It's the safest way to see the worst areas. Our guide is a hero in this long-standing war against Islamic extremist terrorists, General Lito Sobihana. He heads up a joint task force of the Philippine military. Today, the general and his men are actively working to save more than a dozen kidnapped victims held by Islamic extremists. The day before, one of the general's men was shot and 6 terrorists killed.
Was the fighting yesterday related to the kidnappings or something different?
Yes, it's part of our rescue effort.
The battle actually goes back decades.
That island is the island province of Basilan. I was stationed there in the 90s, and I was even wounded in that island, seriously wounded, because I had 5 gunshot wounds all over my body and several sharp.
Fighting Abu Sayyaf.
Fighting is Abu Sayyaf.
Abu Sayyaf is considered one of the most violent Islamic jihadist groups, responsible for the Philippines' worst terrorist attack, the 2004 bombing of a ferry that murdered 116 people. Sobhana received the Philippine Medal of Honor for his heroics in fighting Abu Sayyaf in the 90s. 2 decades later, Abu Sayyaf is now said to be lining up with ISIS, prompting some to make the argument that Islamic extremism in the Philippines deserves more of the world's attention.
We are now in the middle of the 2 islands of Santa Cruz. These islands are part of Zamboanga. And
earlier, we spoke with General Sobhana at Camp Navarro, headquarters of the Western Mindanao Command.
Could you explain in just a sentence or two to the American audience what the fighting is about?
Well, initially, they followed the ideology of establishing Islamic independence in Mindanao.
Islamic separatists here in the southern Philippines, he says, have been using violence to try to break away and establish an Islamic state. We're there when the general takes a call from the frantic wife of a hostage. If she doesn't pay ransom, the terrorists say they'll behead him. But there's a strict no-ransom policy. ISIS didn't pioneer the notion of violently establishing an international Islamic state or caliphate. Muslim extremists in Mindanao have been conducting a terrorist campaign for an independent Islamic state since the 1970s.
We've had reports and information coming in that there's been foreign fighters from Saudi, from Yemen, etc., down in Mindanao for 4 years now.
Jean Yu is a former Green Beret with U.S. Special Forces supporting Philippine troops fighting the terrorists. He now helps run a private security firm here. He says with ISIS losing its footing in Iraq and Syria, seasoned fighters fleeing the Mideast are now showing up in the Philippines, where there are many sympathizers.
These guys are battle-hardened fighters or terrorists that have survived essentially the war, going head-to-head with Western military and special operations. These people are not dumb. Okay, they're not incompetent fighters, right? To survive that long, only the best guys have survived that long.
In May, fighting escalated when hundreds of terrorists attacked the Philippine Army in the region's island city of Marawi, population 200,000. Civilians were taken hostage, thousands fled. Nearly the entire city was later evacuated. After months of fighting, 400 terrorists were dead. So were more than 100 civilians and Philippine troops. After the latest siege in Marawi, the Philippines has requested additional support from America in its ongoing fight against Islamic extremists.
And the field commanders in the Philippines.
At a recent hearing in the U.S., Joint Chiefs of Staff Vice Chairman General Paul Selva suggested that with ISIS now moving into the Philippines, it might be time for a new commitment, or else, he said, there would be a possible long-term catastrophe.
In every case where we see the resurgence of terror networks, particularly in the fragile areas of the southern Philippines, I think it's worth considering whether or not we reinstate a named operation.
The ongoing battle is what prompted Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte to declare emergency martial law in May in the Muslim-majority region. It allows the military to act as the police and to make arrests without warrants. The declaration of martial law has sparked some criticism both in the Philippines and internationally. We were there in July when their Congress voted overwhelmingly to extend martial law through the end of the year. We also found support for martial law on the streets of Zamboanga from people actually living under the terrorist threat.
Do you support the martial law?
Yes, for the peace and order of this country, especially in Mindanao.
Do most people support martial law, do you think, most people who live here?
Yes.
Our
This man sells pork at a local market and worries about terrorists coming from the Mideast and connecting with local groups like Abu Sayyaf.
This martial law here in the Philippines, in Mindanao, is favorable for us.
Here in the southern Philippines, there are places where tourists and locals can't move freely without fear of being snatched off the street by Muslim terrorist thugs who raise money demanding ransom. The beheading of this Canadian tourist last year sparked an international outrage. 4 more victims were captured right before our visit.
Well, right now in my area of responsibility, that is the whole province of Basilan, there are 20. It used to be 16, and there were 4 additional victims.
Kidnapped?
Kidnapped victims, yes. And we are trying our best effort to rescue them safely. We have the policy of no ransom, so we do not allow ransom money to get into the hands of the abductors.
He knows where the terrorists are, he says, but can't simply blow them up because they hide among their wives, children, and community. Meantime, General Sobihana continues in his 3rd decade of fighting a familiar and brutal enemy.
We've talked to some observers who really want this to obviously get under control because they fear people like the Islamic State and other extremists could see this as an opening, this region, to come in and spread more ideologically based violence here. Do you worry about that happening?
Well, I think there are indicators that they are here already.
They're working to keep a migrating threat in the war on terror from establishing a new beachhead in Southeast Asia.
The typhoons came and
Antonio Carpio is a Supreme Court justice in the Philippines, a man who has played David to China's Goliath in an international dispute in the South China Sea.
There was a standoff sometime in April of 2012 between Philippine Coast Guard vessels and Chinese Coast Guard vessels.
Claiming historic rights in 2012, China seized the Philippine waters known as Scarborough Shoal in one of the world's busiest commercial waterways, hundreds of miles from the Chinese coast. When China refused to back down, there didn't seem to be much the small island country could do to reclaim its territory until Carpio and other Philippine officials decided to sue.
We had no choice but really since we did not have the military capability to retake Scarborough Shoal, we had to bring a suit against China. We have to sue China before a tribunal of the UN Convention.
This past July, the International Tribunal ruled that China's territorial land grab was illegal, but that didn't end the dispute.
The Philippines won its lawsuit against China, correct?
Yes.
What was the impact? Did China change its ways?
No, well, China did not. China said that we are not complying with the ruling.
China's claims over almost the entire China Sea is upending an order the U.S. has helped keep since World War II. And it's concerning to 5 other nations that have become prosperous in part by using these busy shipping lanes where they claim maritime territory. Will China move to control or even block them? At his nomination hearing, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson talked tough.
They're taking territory or control or declaring control of territories that are not rightfully China's. The island building in the South China Sea itself, in many respects, in my view, building islands and then putting military assets on those islands is akin to Russia's taking of Crimea.
The history of the seas and the laws that rule them were written over centuries and with blood. The permanent U.S. Navy was founded in 1794 to battle Barbary pirates who threatened the freedom of navigation and trade in the Mediterranean. In the 21st century, an age-old problem and a potential new battle on the seas. Until a few years ago, these little reefs and sand cays in the Spratly Islands off the coast of the Philippines and South Vietnam were largely uninhabited, wanted only as fertile fishing grounds. Now the Chinese have converted them into military outposts equipped with runways and sophisticated radar towers.
Currently what we're looking at is some construction on a landing strip.
And Chinese Navy ships have recently warned and harassed ships at sea, including U.S. Navy ships, which they see as meddling in their business.
Should we be worried about that?
You should be worried.
Senator Lindsey Graham serves on the Armed Services Committee and is pressing for the U.S. to take a stronger stance in the South China Sea.
Because the last thing you want is a communist dictatorship to be able to control an entire part of the world. Instead of negotiating who owns an island, they just build a military base on the island. They don't respect the rule of law.
Can you explain in a sentence why we ought to care, why a guy that's minding his own business in the Midwest ought to care?
The sea lanes that we all use to ship products in and out of the country go right by China. That part of the world is the growing part of the world in terms of economic opportunity. The Pacific sea lanes, the South China Sea are essential to do business. The last thing you want to do is give up market share to China, withdraw from Asia, and allow them to militarily dominate the sea lanes. History has shown us the people that control the seas do very well.
Why is the challenges that China has made so important to the global community, do you think?
Because we have this law of the sea, where 167 countries have ratified, and China is saying we are not bound by that. And if China can claim the South China Sea as its internal lake, Russia might claim the Arctic Ocean. India might claim the Indian Ocean. So then the entire order in the oceans and seas of our planet will break down. Every country will assert what it can claim through might, through naval power, and we'll have wars.
Love him or hate him, Rodrigo Duterte is one president who's delivering on his biggest campaign promise: to crack down on drug crimes by targeting not only traffickers, but addicts, and killing them in cold blood. 3 months after he was elected last year, Duterte, a former prosecutor, compared himself to Hitler, with the distinction that his victims would be criminals.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there is 3 million, there's a 3 million drug addicts. There are. I'd be happy to slaughter them.
Last May 2016, we had our elections, and the Filipino people elected President Rodrigo Duterte, who unfortunately has authoritarian tendencies, and who pledged during the campaign that he would kill 100,000 Filipinos.
Senator Antonio Fuentes Trillanes is another product of the Philippines' bizarre politics.
Just keep on fighting. Hold on to your ideals.
In 2003, he attempted a coup against the allegedly corrupt president at the time. He was imprisoned, ran for the Senate from jail, and won. Today, he's one of the few members of Congress opposing President Duterte.
Is it true that the president has basically given the authority to citizens to shoot and gun down people if they're drug dealers?
Yes, he has done that several times publicly. He called for the police to kill suspects, the ordinary civilians, to kill the sons or daughters of their neighbors or suspected users, and he even called on the migrant workers to come back home so that they can help in the purging of Philippine society.
How many people have been killed because they are drug users or drug pushers since Duterte has been elected?
By our own estimate and projections, it has exceeded 10,000 people killed already.
A new documentary, Duterte's Hell, depicts the brutal reality. Suspected drug dealers and users gunned down without trial.
It's not a dog, my son. It's not a dog or a pig to kill like them.
Congressman Gary Alejano has filed an impeachment complaint against President Duterte. Like Senator Trillanes, he was in on that 2003 coup attempt, served time, and now serves in Congress.
Well, the basis of the impeachment complaint is that we have been opposing the policies of the president, especially on the issue of policy on killing or extrajudicial killing without going through due process of law and respect for human rights.
Is that popular here?
It depends on the propaganda of the president. He changed the definition of the rule of law, and he changed the definition of human rights. If you are a criminal, you're not anymore human, and you don't have human rights. So he is pursuing populist policies and programs using the government, and that is why he has high ratings.
High ratings most national leaders only dream of. During our summer visit, Duterte's popularity hit a stunning 82%. Needless to say, the whole impeachment idea hasn't gained much ground. Besides his brutal war on drugs, Duterte's popularity is also rooted in his tough stance against Islamic extremist terrorists.
Our national leadership is very aware of what is happening around the country, especially on the ISIS trying to create chaos.
General Lito Sobejana says with ISIS moving into the southern Philippines, President Duterte is doing what it takes to battle a savage enemy, including declaring martial law.
Do you think that's helping the security situation, the martial law?
It will definitely help us resolve this problem.
On the streets of Zamboanga in the Mindanao province, where there's martial law, we traveled with heavily armed protectors and found popular support for President Duterte.
What is your opinion of the president?
About the president, I think he is brave and he is really a capable president in this country.
Why do you say you think he's brave?
Because he stopped the drug here in our country.
You've seen a difference?
Yes, a lot of difference.
What is your opinion of President Duterte?
Well, he's a very good leader, aside from the past president.
What do you like about his leadership?
Strong and determined.
Strong and determined.
Yes.
Especially with what's happened.
Jose Cuisia was the Philippines' ambassador to the U.S. under the last president.
Are you more optimistic or pessimistic then about things under this president?
You know, it's very difficult to say because there have been certainly benefits or I would say very positive developments. Criminality has come down because of the fear precisely that's been instilled by the president, even among the criminals. There's been a big drop. But on the other hand, there's also concern that human rights violations are on the rise.
When it comes to the odd political dynamics in the Philippines, perhaps our strangest interview was with Congressman Harry Roque.
Is President Duterte a popular president? Is it too complicated of a story to tell in a word?
Well, I think Americans will have difficulty trying to understand why the president remains as widely popular as he is today. 82% approval rating, that's fantastic, no, as far as polling is concerned. And I think it's because he has shied away from the mold of a traditional politician who's sweet-talking, promising the heaven and earth. Here is a guy who is, you know, no pretension. He resorts to foul language. He doesn't care about niceties. And he's saying, I'm going to deliver. I'm going to clean up our streets. I'm going to make our communities safer. And to his credit, after a year, communities are safer. And that's why people are saying maybe he is the kind of leader that we have long waited for.
But while he considers President Duterte a friend and ally, in the same breath, he says the president may be held criminally liable for encouraging the street killings of drug criminals.
There are many people who are criticizing the president. What is your position on the criticisms that he's facing?
Warning the president that unless he investigates, prosecutes, and punishes the responsible individuals for the drug killings, that he himself may incur criminal responsibility pursuant to what is known as command responsibility, knowing that the crime is happening and not doing anything to investigate and prosecute these crimes.
Make sure I have it clear. Do you like President Duterte, and do you support President Duterte?
Yes. I like President Duterte, I support President Duterte, but, you know, within the framework of the rule of law and promotion of human rights. I think as a friend, I have warned him that he better start prosecuting and sending the killers to jail, because if he does not, he may end up in jail himself.
As if an exclamation point on the whole strange political dynamics in the Philippines, our last word with Senator Trillanes.
Mr. Duterte ordered a hit on me, and I confirmed that with at least 4 credible sources. He wants me killed, and but we just need to do what we have to do.
How come you don't have bodyguards around you all the time?
They're around.